the wooden game pieces scattered across the dining room table as Lindsay Chen leaned back in her chair, a smirk playing at the corners of her mouth. "Oh, Emma, strategy games really aren't for everyone. Maybe we should stick to something more. Your speed next time. Pictionary, perhaps?" Her voice carried that particular brand of condescension wrapped in false sweetness that I'd grown to recognize over the past 2 years of family game nights. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." I stared down at the Settlers of Catan board where my settlement sat pathetically isolated, my resource cards telling the story of another spectacular defeat. Around the table, Jake's family exchanged those knowing glances that said everything, without words. My husband squeezed my shoulder sympathetically, but even his touch felt like consolation rather than support. "It's just a game," I managed, forcing a smile that felt like swallowing glass. But we all knew it wasn't just a game. In the Rodriguez family, these monthly gatherings were a battlefield disguised as entertainment, and I was losing every single war. My name is Emma Rodriguez, though I still sometimes forget to respond to my married name after 2 years. At 28, I work as a graphic designer for a boutique marketing agency in downtown Denver, creating visual campaigns that help small businesses tell their stories. It's work that requires creativity, problem-solving, and yes, strategic thinking, though apparently those skills don't translate to the sacred realm of board games according to my sister-in-law. I met Jake 3 years ago at a coffee shop in the Highlands neighborhood where I'd moved after college. He was struggling with a presentation on his laptop, muttering about pie charts and quarterly projections, and I'd offered to help redesign his slides. One thing led to another, and before I knew it, I was head over heels for this sweet, methodical accountant who balanced my artistic chaos with his structured world. What I hadn't anticipated was inheriting his family's intense relationship with competition. The Rodriguez clan treated game night like an intellectual Olympics, complete with unspoken rankings, strategic alliances, and the kind of trash talk usually reserved for professional sports. Jake had warned me they were competitive, but I'd assumed he meant the playful kind of competition you see in commercials where everyone laughs and bonds over shared defeat. I was spectacularly wrong. Carol and David Rodriguez had been hosting these gatherings for over 5 years, turning their Lakewood home into a monthly shrine to strategic gameplay. The dining room table, a massive oak piece that dominated the space, served as our arena. Built-in shelves along the walls displayed an impressive collection of board games, organized by complexity and player count with the precision Jake applied to his tax spreadsheets. Lindsay had been the undisputed champion long before I arrived on the scene. She possessed that particular combination of analytical thinking and ruthless execution that made her formidable at everything from resource management games to territorial conquest. Her background in marketing had honed her ability to read people, anticipate moves, and manipulate situations to her advantage. She wielded strategy like a weapon, and she'd never encountered an opponent who could challenge her reign. Until tonight, she'd been patient with my presence. Tolerant, even. She'd explain rules with exaggerated clarity, offer gentle suggestions that always seemed to benefit her position more than mine, and maintain that saccharine smile while systematically dismantling whatever pitiful strategy I'd attempted to construct. But something had shifted in recent months. Maybe it was the way Jake had started defending my potential more vocally, or perhaps she'd grown tired of easy victories. Whatever the reason, her patience had curdled into something sharper, more openly dismissive. "Strategy games require a particular type of thinking," she'd announced during our last gathering while teaching me Splendor. "You have to see several moves ahead, understand resource allocation, anticipate your opponent's plans. It's almost mathematical in its logic." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Artists, her tone suggested, simply weren't built for such intellectual rigor. The worst part wasn't even Lindsay's condescension. It was watching Jake's family slowly adopt her assessment of my capabilities. Carol, who'd initially welcomed me with genuine warmth, now offered simplified game suggestions with apologetic smiles. David, a retired engineering professor who I'd hoped might appreciate the problem-solving aspects of design work, had started explaining basic concepts with the patience reserved for children or the intellectually challenged. Even Marcus, Lindsay's own husband, seemed to accept that his wife's dominance was natural law. He'd nod approvingly at her brilliant moves while shooting me sympathetic looks that said he understood what it felt like to live in her strategic shadow. Tonight's defeat had been particularly brutal. We'd played Ticket to Ride, a railway-themed game that should have appealed to my visual sensibilities. The colorful train routes sprawling across the board reminded me of the transit maps I'd designed for the city's tourism campaign last year. But understanding the aesthetic and executing the strategy proved to be entirely different challenges. Lindsay had systematically blocked my routes while building an efficient network that connected major cities with ruthless precision. She'd claimed the longest continuous route, completed multiple destination tickets, and accumulated points with the kind of calculated efficiency that made my scattered approach look like random button pushing. "The key is thinking holistically," she'd explained while tallying her impressive score. "You can't just focus on individual routes. You have to consider the entire network, anticipate bottlenecks, plan for contingencies. It's about seeing the bigger picture." Her eyes had met mine across the table. Some people are naturally better at that kind of comprehensive thinking. Jake had tried to intervene, pointing out that I'd successfully completed 2 destination tickets, but his defense felt hollow against the stark reality of the scoreboard. Lindsay had nearly doubled my points, and everyone at the table knew it. Wasn't luck or experience. It was pure intellectual superiority, at least according to the narrative that had solidified around these gatherings. As we'd packed up the game pieces, Carol had suggested we try something lighter next month. "Maybe a party game where everyone can participate equally," she'd said with the kind of gentle suggestion that felt like being patted on the head. The implication was clear. I needed games designed for broader accessibility, not the sophisticated strategic challenges that the family truly enjoyed. The drive home had been quiet, Jake navigating the familiar streets between his parents' house and our townhouse while I stared out the passenger window at the Denver skyline. The city lights blurred past like scattered thoughts, and I found myself wondering how I'd become the family charity case, the spouse who needed accommodation rather than challenge. "You know they don't mean anything by it," Jake had finally said, breaking the silence as we pulled into our driveway. "Lindsay's just naturally competitive. She gets carried away sometimes." But I could hear the doubt in his voice, the same uncertainty that had been creeping into his defenses of my potential. Even my own husband was starting to wonder if maybe his family was right about my limitations. That night, lying in bed while Jake slept peacefully beside me, I replayed every move from the evening's game. Not just the mechanical choices of which routes to claim or which cards to draw, but the subtle social dynamics that played out alongside the official rules. The way Lindsay had guided conversation to distract other players during crucial decisions. How she'd offered helpful suggestions that coincidentally benefited her position. The strategic value of appearing generous while actually maintaining every possible advantage. I'd been playing the wrong game entirely. While I'd focused on the boards and pieces and official objectives, Lindsay had been orchestrating a more complex competition that encompassed psychology, social manipulation, and the careful construction of narrative. She wasn't just winning games, she was winning the story about who belonged at this table and who didn't. But lying there in the darkness, something crystallized in my mind with the same clarity that came when I finally found the perfect color palette for a difficult design project. I understood exactly what I'd been missing. And more importantly, I understood what I needed to do about it. The family had already written me off as intellectually inferior, someone who needed simpler challenges and patient accommodation. They'd created a comfortable story about my limitations that allowed them to feel generous in their inclusion while maintaining their sense of intellectual superiority. What they didn't realize was that underestimation could become the most powerful weapon in any strategic arsenal. They'd given me the perfect camouflage for what I was about to become. The next morning, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and my laptop, not working on client projects for the first time in months during weekend hours. Instead, I was researching board game forums, strategy guides, video tutorials, mathematical analyses of optimal play patterns. I dove into the intellectual framework behind every game in Carol and David's collection, absorbing theory and tactics with the same focused intensity I'd once applied to mastering design software. Jake found me there hours later, surrounded by printed articles and notebook pages covered with probability calculations and strategic flowcharts. "What's all this?" he asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. "Research," I said simply, not looking. "Up from an article about resource optimization in engine-building games. I'm tired of being the family mascot." He studied the papers scattered across our dining table, and I saw something shift in his expression. Maybe it was recognition that I'd been more affected by last night than I'd let on, or perhaps he was finally seeing the analytical mind that my creative work had always required, but that his family had never bothered to notice. "You don't have to prove anything to them," he said, but there was hope in his voice, hope that maybe I actually could. "Yes, I do," I replied, finally meeting his eyes. "But not for the reasons you think." Over the following weeks, I maintained my normal routine on the surface. I went to work, completed client projects, socialized with friends, and participated in all the ordinary rhythms of our married life. But underneath that familiar exterior, I was constructing something entirely new. I studied game theory with the dedication of a graduate student. I analyzed decision trees and probability matrices. I memorized optimal opening strategies and endgame patterns. I learned to recognize the mathematical underpinnings that governed resource allocation and territorial control. More importantly, I studied Lindsay herself. I watched YouTube videos of her favorite games, not to learn the rules, but to understand her thinking patterns. I identified her preferred strategies, her risk tolerance, her psychological tells. I mapped out her competitive personality with the same systematic approach I used for complex branding projects. During my lunch breaks, I visited the Dice Roll, a local board game cafe where I could practice against experienced players who didn't know me as the family failure. I lost frequently at first, but I learned something valuable from every defeat. I discovered that my creative background actually provided significant advantages once I learned to channel it properly. Visual pattern recognition, spatial reasoning, and the ability to see connections between seemingly unrelated elements, all skills honed by years of design work, translated beautifully to strategic gameplay once I understood how to apply them. Jake noticed the changes gradually. I'd started winning our casual two-player games at home, making moves that surprised him with their sophistication. When he'd comment on my improvement, I'd shrug and attribute it to finally understanding the rules better. I let him think it was natural progression rather than intensive preparation. The real test would come at the next family gathering, still 3 weeks away. 3 weeks to refine my approach, to perfect the psychological elements that would be just as important as the strategic ones. Because I wasn't just planning to win games, I was planning to win the war for respect, recognition, and my rightful place at that table. Lindsay had spent 2 years establishing herself as the intellectual superior, the strategic mastermind who graciously tolerated my presence while demonstrating my inadequacy. She'd crafted a narrative about natural talent and inherent capability. That positioned her as fundamentally different from someone like me. What she didn't understand was that narratives could be rewritten, stories could be changed, and sometimes the most powerful transformation happened when nobody saw it coming. As the next game night approached, I felt the familiar nervousness that had always accompanied these gatherings. But underneath the anxiety was something new, something that felt like potential energy waiting to be released. Lindsay had taught me that strategy games weren't just about the moves you made on the board. They were about the moves you made in people's minds. And I was finally ready to play her game. The second Saturday of the month arrived with the crisp, autumn air that made Denver feel electric with possibility. I spent the morning at my easel, working on a personal watercolor project that had nothing to do with client deadlines or strategic preparation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The familiar rhythm of brush against paper helped calm the anticipation thrumming through my veins like caffeine. Jake was in the kitchen making his famous breakfast burritos, a weekend ritual that usually signaled lazy mornings and Netflix marathons. But today felt different. Today felt like the beginning of something that would change everything. "You seem relaxed for game night," he observed, sliding a plate across our granite counter. "Usually you're stress cleaning the house by now." I accepted the burrito with a smile that felt more genuine than any I'd managed in recent months. "I've been thinking about what you said. Maybe I don't need to prove anything to anyone." The lie came easily, wrapped in enough truth to feel comfortable. I had been thinking about proving things, just not in the way Jake imagined. He nodded, approvingly, clearly relieved that I'd apparently made peace with my role as the family's beloved underachiever. What he couldn't see were the 15 strategy guides bookmarked on my laptop, the notebook filled with probability calculations hidden in my desk drawer, or the hours I'd spent at the dice roll perfecting techniques that would have surprised everyone who thought they knew me. We arrived at Carol and David's house promptly at 6, Jake carrying a bottle of wine while I brought homemade chocolate chip cookies that I'd actually baked from scratch rather than picking up from the grocery store bakery. Small details mattered when you were rebuilding someone's perception of your capabilities. The familiar warmth of the Rodriguez family home enveloped us as we stepped through the front door. Carol's decorating style leaned heavily into cozy traditionalism, with family photos covering every surface and the kind of overstuffed furniture that invited long conversations. The dining room table was already set up with tonight's selection, Splendor, a gem trading game that required engine-building strategy and resource management. Lindsay was arranging the gem tokens with her characteristic precision, each colored stack perfectly aligned. She looked up as we entered, offering that practiced smile that had once made me feel welcomed, but now registered as barely concealed condescension. "Emma, I'm so glad you decided to join us again. I was worried last month might have been discouraging." Her voice carried the same tone someone might use when addressing a child who'd fallen off their bicycle. "I thought we'd try Splendor tonight. It's a bit more accessible than some of our usual choices." Marcus was setting up chairs while Sophia, their 8-year-old daughter, played with building blocks in the adjacent living room. David emerged from the kitchen with beer and sparkling water, greeting us with the kind of genuine warmth that made his subtle intellectual dismissals even more painful. "How's the design business, Emma?" he asked, settling into his usual chair at the head of the table. "Still making those colorful advertisements?" The question stung not because it was cruel, but because it was reductive. I'd spent 5 years building expertise in brand strategy, consumer psychology, and visual communication. But to David, my work was just colorful advertisements. It was the kind of casual diminishment that had been eroding my confidence for months. "Business is good," I replied evenly. "Actually, I just finished a campaign that increased client engagement by 40% through strategic visual storytelling." Lindsay looked up from the game components with interest that felt performative. "Oh, that's wonderful. It's so important to have creative people who can make things pretty." Make things pretty. As if the strategic thinking behind effective design communication was just decorative frosting rather than the psychological architecture that influenced consumer behavior. I felt that familiar flush of frustration, but this time it was accompanied by something else: anticipation. Carol finished setting out snacks and took her seat beside David. "Should we start with the rules explanation?" she asked, glancing at me with the kind of gentle consideration usually reserved for elderly relatives or recent surgery patients. "I think I remember the basics," I said, picking up one of the gem tokens and turning it over in my palm. "You collect gems to buy development cards, which give you permanent gem bonuses and prestige points. First to 15 points wins." "That's right," Lindsay said with exaggerated enthusiasm. "Though there's quite a bit more strategy involved in the optimal purchasing patterns and reserve mechanics. But you'll pick it up as we play." She began dealing out the development cards with practiced efficiency, creating the pyramid of available purchases that would drive the game's economy. I watched her movements carefully, noting how she glanced at the higher-tier cards to assess long-term opportunities. Lindsay always played with a plan that extended far beyond the immediate turn, building toward expensive cards that would generate massive point swings in the endgame. We drew our starting hands and began the familiar dance of gem collection and card evaluation. I started conservatively, taking 3 different colored gems on my first turn, just as I had in every previous game. Lindsay nodded approvingly at my choice, clearly expecting another evening of gentle guidance and inevitable victory. But on my second turn, something shifted. Instead of the cautious, reactive play that had characterized my previous attempts, I made a move that surprised everyone at the table. I reserved a high-tier card that wouldn't be accessible for several rounds, simultaneously blocking Lindsay's obvious development path while securing a gold token that would prove crucial later. "Interesting choice," Marcus commented, studying the board with new attention. "That's quite forward-thinking." Lindsay's smile flickered almost imperceptibly. "Yes, very ambitious. Though you'll want to be careful not to overextend too early." But I could see the calculation happening behind her eyes. She was reassessing the game state, trying to understand why I'd made a move that demonstrated such long-term planning. For the first time since I'd joined these family gatherings, Lindsay was actually paying attention to my strategy rather than simply tolerating my presence. The game progressed with increasing tension. I built my engine methodically, acquiring low-cost cards that provided gem bonuses while maintaining focus on my reserved high-value target. Each purchase was calculated to maximize efficiency while maintaining flexibility for future opportunities. Lindsay adapted her strategy to counter what she perceived as beginner's luck, but she was still playing against the Emma she thought she knew. The Emma who made impulsive decisions based on pretty artwork rather than mathematical optimization. The Emma who needed patient explanation and gentle guidance. She wasn't playing against the Emma who had spent 3 weeks studying probability, matrices, and optimal purchasing algorithms. By the mid-game, I had established a remarkably efficient engine. My development cards were generating enough gem bonuses that I could afford purchases that would have been impossible through token collection alone. More importantly, I was timing my moves to create cascading opportunities that would accelerate my progress toward the 15-point victory condition. "You're really getting the hang of this," Carol observed with genuine surprise. "Your card selection is much more coordinated than usual." Jake was watching with an expression I hadn't seen before. Pride, certainly, but also curiosity about where this sudden strategic competence had originated. I caught his eye across the table and offered a small smile that gave nothing away. Lindsay was no longer offering helpful suggestions. She was fully engaged now, treating me as an actual opponent rather than a friendly charity case. Her moves became more aggressive, more calculated to disrupt my development while advancing her own position. But she was still operating under the assumption that my improvement was intuitive rather than studied. The turning point came when I executed a purchase sequence that required precise resource management and perfect timing. I bought 3 cards in rapid succession, using the gem bonuses from each purchase to enable the next one, culminating in the acquisition of my reserved high-tier card. The combination generated 7 prestige points in a single turn while establishing permanent bonuses that would dominate the endgame. The table fell silent, David's beer paused halfway to his lips. Carol's eyebrows rose in genuine astonishment. Marcus whistled low under his breath. Lindsay stared at the board, recalculating everything she thought she understood about the game state. That was quite sophisticated, she said slowly. How did you see that combination? I've been thinking more about resource optimization. Lately, I replied casually, as if stumbling across advanced strategic concepts was perfectly natural. My design work requires similar planning skills. The comparison was deliberate. I was drawing connections between my professional expertise and strategic gameplay, forcing them to reconsider their assumptions about the intellectual requirements of creative work. But I delivered it lightly, without defensiveness or obvious agenda. Jake leaned forward, studying my card layout with new interest. I never thought about the parallels between design strategy and game strategy. But you're right. They both require thinking several steps ahead. Exactly, I said, warming to the theme. Visual communication campaigns need the same kind of systematic building that you see in engine-building games. You establish foundational elements that enable more complex effects, just like these gem bonuses create purchasing opportunities. Lindsay was still analyzing the board, trying to identify recovery options from her suddenly disadvantaged position. She'd been so focused on playing her usual dominant game that she hadn't adapted quickly enough to the new competitive landscape. For the first time in family game night history, she was behind and scrambling to catch up. The final rounds played out with delicious tension. Lindsay fought valiantly, leveraging her experience and natural strategic instincts to close the gap, but she was operating from a fundamental disadvantage. She'd lost crucial early game tempo by underestimating my capabilities, and now she was paying the mathematical price for that miscalculation. I crossed the 15-point threshold with a final purchase that demonstrated perfect resource management. Not only had I won, but I'd won decisively, with an efficiency that suggested deep understanding rather than beginner's luck. The aftermath was fascinating to observe. David was examining my card layout like it contained secrets to the universe. Carol was shaking her head in amazement, clearly revising her assessment of my intellectual capabilities. Marcus was grinning, with the kind of appreciation reserved for genuinely impressive performances. But Lindsay's reaction was the most telling. She sat back in her chair, studying me with new eyes that held something I'd never seen before. Respect. Not the patronizing tolerance that had characterized our previous interactions, but actual strategic respect between equals. That was genuinely brilliant play, she said finally, and the admission seemed to cost her something. I completely underestimated your approach. Where did that come from? The question hung in the air with weight that extended far beyond board game strategy. She was asking how I'd hidden such capability, how I'd allowed myself to appear incompetent for so long, how the family hierarchy had been so thoroughly wrong about my potential. I guess I just needed to start thinking about it differently, I said, keeping my tone modest while my heart raced with triumph. Once I understood the underlying patterns, everything clicked into place. Jake reached over and squeezed my hand, and I could feel his excitement radiating through his touch. This wasn't just pride in my game night victory. This was recognition that he'd married someone more complex and capable than any of them had realized. We should definitely play this again next month, David said, already reaching for another beer. I'd like to see if you can repeat that performance or if it was a fluke. The word fluke carried challenge rather than dismissal. For the first time since I'd joined this family, David was treating me as a worthy opponent, rather than someone who needed accommodation. The shift in dynamics was subtle, but unmistakable. Lindsay began packing up the game components with thoughtful precision. You know, Emma, I might have some strategy books you'd find interesting, if you're serious about exploring this kind of thinking. The offer was unprecedented. Lindsay had never shared resources before, never treated my potential as something worth developing. She was acknowledging that I belonged in conversations about strategic thinking, that my mind was worth cultivating rather than accommodating. As we prepared to leave, Carol pulled me aside in the kitchen while the men discussed weekend plans in the living room. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly, her voice carrying genuine regret. "I've been underestimating you terribly. That was some of the most sophisticated gameplay I've seen at this table." The admission meant more than she probably realized. Carol's approval had always mattered to me, and hearing her acknowledge that she'd been wrong about my capabilities felt like validation of everything I'd worked toward. "Thank you," I said simply. "I appreciate that." "Lindsay's not going to take this lying down," she continued with a small smile. "She's never had real competition before. You might have just started something." The warning felt more like a promise. Carol was telling me that I'd successfully disrupted the established order, that the family dynamics I'd accepted for 2 years were about to change dramatically. On the drive home, Jake was unusually quiet until we reached our neighborhood. "Okay, what's really going on?" he asked as we pulled into our driveway. "What do you mean?" "Come on, Emma. People don't just suddenly develop advanced strategic thinking overnight. That wasn't lucky. That was systematic. You've been preparing for this." I turned to face him in the darkened car, seeing curiosity rather than accusation in his expression. "Would that bother you?" "Are you kidding? It's incredibly attractive. I just want to understand what motivated it." So I told him, not everything, but enough. I explained how tired I'd become of being seen as intellectually inferior, how the casual dismissals had been affecting my confidence, how I'd decided to prove that creative thinking and strategic thinking weren't mutually exclusive. I wanted them to see me differently, I concluded. Not just as your artistic wife who needs simpler games and patient explanations. Jake was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications of what I'd revealed. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "I didn't realize how bad it had gotten. I should have defended you more actively." "It's not your fault," I assured him. "But things are going to be different now." "Good," he said firmly. "It's about time they saw what I've known all along." That night, I lay in bed replaying every moment of the evening. The surprise on their faces when I executed complex strategic sequences. The shift from condescension to respect in Lindsay's voice. The way David had started discussing tactics with me rather than explaining basics to me. But most importantly, I replayed the moment when I'd crossed that 15-point threshold and claimed victory. Not just victory in a board game, but victory in the larger competition for recognition, respect, and legitimate membership in the family's intellectual community. Tomorrow I would continue my preparation. There were more games to master, more strategies to develop, more assumptions to shatter. Because tonight had proven something crucial. They had no idea what I was really capable of, and I was just getting started. The weeks between game nights took on a different quality after my splendor victory. Jake's attitude toward me had shifted in subtle but meaningful ways. He started asking my opinion on strategic decisions at work, consulting me about client approaches that required creative problem-solving. The respect in his voice when he described my game night performance to friends was something I'd never heard before. But Lindsay's reaction was far more complex and dangerous than I'd anticipated. 3 days after our gathering, she called me directly for the first time since I'd married into the family. Not Jake, not a group message through Carol, but my personal cell phone while I was reviewing design mock-ups at my downtown office. "Emma, hi. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Her voice carried that bright cheerfulness that I'd learned to recognize as camouflage for deeper intentions. "Just working on a campaign for a sustainable fashion brand," I replied, saving my file and giving her my full attention. "What's up?" "I wanted to chat about game night. Your performance was really remarkable, and I've been thinking about ways we could enhance the experience for everyone." The pause before enhance sent warning signals through my mind. Lindsay was planning something, and I doubted it would benefit anyone but herself. "I appreciate that," I said carefully. "What did you have in mind?" "Well, I was thinking we might introduce some more challenging games. Really test everyone's strategic capabilities. I found this fascinating game called Brass, Birmingham that involves Industrial Revolution economics. Very complex resource management and timing decisions." I'd heard of Brass, Birmingham. It was notorious among serious board gamers for its steep learning curve and punishing strategic depth. The kind of game that separated casual players from true strategists, where a single mistake could cascade into inevitable defeat. "That sounds interesting," I said, already planning my research approach. "I'd love to try something new." "Wonderful. I thought maybe we could have a practice session before the next family gathering. Just you and me, so you can get comfortable with the mechanics without feeling pressured." And there it was. Lindsay was setting a trap, offering to teach me the game in a private setting where she could assess my true capabilities without family witnesses. If I struggled with the advanced mechanics, she'd have ammunition to suggest I wasn't ready for such complex challenges. If I performed well, she'd learn exactly how much I'd been hiding and could prepare countermeasures accordingly. "That's very thoughtful," I replied, accepting the challenge while my mind raced ahead to the preparation it would require. "When were you thinking?" "How about this Saturday afternoon? We could meet at that board game cafe downtown. The Dice Roll, I think it's called." My blood chilled. The Dice Roll was my secret training ground, the place where I'd been honing my skills against experienced players for weeks. If Lindsay chose that location deliberately, it meant she might already know more about my preparation than I'd realized. "Perfect," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I'll see you there at 2? "Excellent. I'm really looking forward to this, Emma. I think you're going to surprise yourself with what you're capable of." After she hung up, I sat staring at my phone screen while anxiety and excitement warred in my chest. This was escalation. Lindsay had moved beyond tolerating my presence to actively testing my limits. She was treating me as a potential threat rather than a harmless amateur, which meant my Splendor victory had accomplished exactly what I'd intended. But it also meant the stakes were rising. Saturday's private session would determine whether I could maintain my newfound credibility or whether Lindsay would expose me as a pretender who'd gotten lucky once. I spent my lunch break at the Dice Roll that very day, not to practice Brass Birmingham, which I'd never played, but to gather intelligence. The cafe's owner, Marcus, was a former tournament player who maintained an impressive library of strategy, guides, and rule summaries. "Brass? Birmingham?" He whistled low when I asked about the game. "That's serious business. Heavy economic engine building with a steep learning curve. You planning to jump into the deep end?" "Something like that," I said, scanning the shelves for relevant materials. "Any advice for a first-time player?" "Study the rulebook thoroughly before you even touch the components. The game has 2 distinct eras with different rules and strategies. Most new players get overwhelmed by the complexity and make fundamental errors that compound throughout the game." He pulled a well-worn strategy guide from behind the counter. "This breaks down the core concepts and common beginner mistakes. But honestly, against an experienced player, you're going to struggle, no matter how much you prepare." "We'll see," I said, accepting the guide with determination that surprised him. The next 3 days blurred together in a haze of intensive study. I downloaded the rulebook, watched tutorial videos, read strategy discussions on specialized forums. Brass Birmingham was indeed brutally complex, with interconnected systems that required deep understanding to navigate effectively. The game simulated industrial development in 18th and 19th century England, with players building networks of coal mines, ironworks, cotton mills, and breweries. Success required managing multiple resource types, timing technological transitions perfectly, and understanding how infrastructure development created opportunities for opponents as well as yourself. What made it particularly challenging was the way early decisions cascaded through both game eras, Mistakes in the canal period would handicap your railway period development, while poor network planning could leave you unable to capitalize on late-game scoring opportunities. But as I absorbed the game's systems, I began to see patterns that reminded me of visual design challenges. Creating effective board presence was similar to establishing visual hierarchy in a complex layout. Resource flow management paralleled the way I directed viewer attention through strategic information architecture. By Friday evening, I felt as prepared as 3 days of intensive study could make me. I'd memorized the card distributions, understood the timing of technological transitions, and identified several viable strategic approaches. Whether that would be enough against Lindsay's experience and natural competitive instincts remained to be seen. Saturday arrived with the kind of crisp November weather that made Denver feel alive with possibility. I dressed casually but deliberately, choosing clothes that projected confidence without arrogance. The drive to the dice roll gave me time to center myself mentally, reviewing key concepts while managing the nervous energy that always preceded important competitions. Lindsay was already waiting when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with the game's imposing box set up beside her. She'd chosen a location away from the main gaming area, ensuring our session would be private and unobserved. "Emma, perfect timing," she said, rising to greet me with that bright smile that never quite reached her eyes. "I took the liberty of getting us coffee. I hope you don't mind that I already unpacked the components." The game board sprawled across the table like a detailed map of industrial England, with spaces for various building types connected by canal and railway networks. Stacks of cards, wooden tokens, and player pieces created an intimidating array of game elements that would have overwhelmed me weeks ago. "This looks incredibly complex," I said truthfully, settling into my chair while surveying the setup. "Are you sure I'm ready for something this advanced?" "Oh, I think you might surprise yourself," Lindsay replied, her tone carrying undertones I couldn't quite decipher. "After your splendor performance, I'm curious to see how you handle real strategic depth." The word real carried sting, implying that my previous victory had been against simplified competition rather than genuine strategic challenge. Lindsay was drawing battle lines, establishing that this game would be the true test of my capabilities. She began explaining the rules with the thoroughness of an experienced teacher, walking through the basic mechanics and strategic considerations with clarity that would have been helpful if I hadn't already spent days studying the same material. I asked appropriate questions and nodded at key points, maintaining the facade of learning while actually evaluating her teaching approach for insights into her strategic thinking. What struck me was how she emphasized certain concepts while glossing over others. She focused heavily on short-term tactical efficiency while spending less time on long-term strategic planning. It suggested her own approach favored aggressive early development over patient infrastructure building. "The key," she explained while demonstrating a sample turn, "is maximizing your actions each round. You want to build, sell, and develop as efficiently as possible without leaving opportunities on the table." But I'd read enough strategy discussions to know that Brass Birmingham rewarded different approaches in different situations. Sometimes patience and strategic restraint were more valuable than aggressive optimization. Lindsay's emphasis on efficiency suggested she might struggle against opponents who played for long-term positional advantage. We began the canal era with me taking the first turn, a decision I'd lobbied for during setup to observe her early development patterns. I chose a conservative opening, building a coal mine in a location that would provide steady income while maintaining flexibility for future expansion. Lindsay's first turn revealed exactly the aggressive approach I'd anticipated. She built multiple structures in rapid succession, leveraging debt financing to accelerate her development beyond what her income could naturally support. It was textbook efficient play, but it also committed her to maintaining aggressive expansion throughout the early game. The canal era progressed with increasing tension as our networks began intersecting and competing for limited resources. I played cautiously but deliberately, building infrastructure that would provide long-term advantages while avoiding the debt load that was constraining Lindsay's flexibility. "You're being very conservative," she observed after I passed on an opportunity to build an expensive cotton mill. "Sometimes you have to take risks to generate the income needed for later expansion." "I'm still learning the rhythm of the game," I replied, though my restraint was actually based on careful calculation. The cotton mill she was encouraging me to build would have required debt financing that would handicap my railway-era development. As the canal era reached its climax, Lindsay's aggressive strategy had given her a significant lead in network development and immediate scoring. Her canals connected major industrial centers with impressive efficiency, and her buildings were generating substantial income each round. But I could see the cracks in her position. Her heavy debt load was limiting her flexibility, and several of her early buildings would become obsolete when we transitioned to the railway era. My more conservative network was smaller, but more sustainable, with infrastructure positioned to support railway development. The transition between eras was where Birmingham separated experienced players from novices. All canal-era buildings became obsolete and were removed from the board, replaced by more advanced railway-era structures. Players who had overinvested in canal infrastructure often found themselves unable to adapt effectively. Lindsay's confidence remained high as we reset the board for the railway era. "You did well for your first canal period," she said, while removing her obsolete buildings. "The railway era is where the real strategy begins." But as we began placing our railway-era buildings, the consequences of our different approaches became apparent. Lindsay's debt-heavy canal strategy had left her with limited capital for railway development, while my conservative approach had preserved the resources needed for expensive railway infrastructure. More critically, my building placement in the canal era had been planned with railway connectivity in mind. While Lindsay had optimized for immediate canal efficiency, I'd positioned structures to create railway development opportunities that were now coming to fruition. The railway era proceeded with roles reversed. Where Lindsay had dominated canal development through aggressive expansion, I now controlled the pace through strategic railway placement and resource management. Each turn revealed new advantages, flowing from my conservative canal strategy. "This is remarkable positioning," Lindsay admitted as I connected distant cities through a railway network that generated massive scoring opportunities. "I completely underestimated your long-term planning." The admission felt like victory, even before the final scoring. Lindsay was acknowledging that I'd out-strategized her not through luck or beginner's fortune, but through superior strategic thinking applied systematically throughout the game. When we tallied the final scores, my victory was decisive. Not close enough to attribute to fortune or favorable card draws, but comprehensive enough to demonstrate genuine strategic superiority. I'd beaten Lindsay at her own game, in her chosen arena, using approaches she hadn't anticipated or prepared for. The aftermath was even more satisfying than the victory itself. Lindsay sat back in her chair, studying the final board position, with the kind of analytical attention she usually reserved for her own successful strategies. "I need to completely reconsider my assessment of your capabilities," she said finally, her voice carrying respect I'd never heard before. "That wasn't beginner's luck. That was sophisticated strategic thinking applied with impressive discipline." "Thank you," I said simply, though my heart was racing with triumph. I've been trying to understand how strategic thinking applies across different domains. "Well, you've certainly accomplished that." She began packing up the game components with thoughtful precision. "I think next month's family game night is going to be much more interesting than usual." The drive home gave me time to process what had just happened. I'd not only defeated Lindsay in single combat, but I'd done so convincingly enough to force her to acknowledge my strategic capabilities. The family dynamic that had marginalized me for 2 years was fundamentally shifting. But as I replayed the afternoon's events, I realized this was just the beginning. Lindsay wasn't going to accept her new status quietly. She'd been the family's strategic champion for too long to surrender that position without a fight. Next month's game night wouldn't be another test or evaluation. It would be war, with Lindsay fully prepared and fighting for her strategic reputation against an opponent she now recognized as genuinely dangerous. And I couldn't wait. The atmosphere at Carol and David's house felt charged with electricity the moment Jake and I walked through the front door. Something had shifted in the family dynamics over the past month, and everyone seemed aware that tonight would be different from previous gatherings. Carol greeted us with unusual excitement, her eyes bright with anticipation. "Emma, dear, Lindsay's been telling everyone about your incredible game last weekend. I can't wait to see what you two accomplish together tonight." Together. The word carried implications that made my stomach flutter with nervous energy. Carol was framing this as collaborative rather than competitive, but I could sense the undercurrent of expectation that ran deeper than casual entertainment. David emerged, from the kitchen carrying his customary beer, but his greeting carried a weight that hadn't been there before. "The strategic mastermind arrives," he said with a grin that seemed genuinely respectful rather than patronizing. "Lindsay's been setting up something special for tonight." Marcus was arranging chairs around the dining table with careful precision, positioning each seat to optimize viewing angles for what promised to be an intensive gaming session. Even Sophia seemed affected by the heightened energy, her usual exuberant chatter replaced by curious observation of the adult preparations. But it was Lindsay's presence that dominated the room's emotional landscape. She moved with purposeful energy, setting up multiple game boxes with the kind of systematic organization usually reserved for important presentations. Her smile when she saw me carried genuine warmth mixed with something that looked remarkably like anticipation for worthy competition. "Emma, perfect timing," she said, approaching with arms extended for an embrace that felt more significant than casual family greeting. "I've been looking forward to this all week." The hug lingered just long enough to feel like acknowledgement of our changed relationship. We were no longer family member and tolerated addition, but strategic equals. Preparing for intellectual combat. "I brought several options tonight," Lindsay continued, gesturing toward the impressive array of game boxes covering the side table. "I thought we might let everyone vote on what they'd prefer to tackle." Jake surveyed the collection with raised eyebrows. These weren't the accessible family games that had characterized previous gatherings. Terraforming Mars, Wingspan, Scythe, Power Grid, each box representing hours of complex strategic gameplay that would challenge even experienced players. "These look significantly more advanced than our usual selections," he observed, glancing between Lindsay and me with curiosity about how this escalation had developed. "Well, we've discovered that our group is capable of handling more sophisticated challenges," Lindsay replied, her eyes meeting mine with shared understanding of exactly what discoveries had led to this evolution. Carol was examining the game descriptions with mixture of excitement and concern. "These all sound fascinating, but are you sure they're not too complicated for a relaxed family evening?" "I think we might surprise ourselves," I said, feeling the confidence that had been building over weeks of intensive preparation. "Sometimes the most rewarding experiences come from embracing complexity rather than avoiding it." David nodded approvingly at my response. Spoken like a true strategist. "What do you think, everyone? Should we venture into deeper waters tonight?" The family discussion that followed revealed how dramatically perceptions had shifted since my initial splendor victory. The railway era proceeded with roles reversed. Where Lindsay had dominated canal development through aggressive expansion, I now controlled the pace through strategic railway placement and resource management. Each turn revealed new advantages, flowing from my conservative canal strategy. "This is remarkable positioning," Lindsay admitted as I connected distant cities through a railway network that generated massive scoring opportunities. "I completely underestimated your long-term planning." The admission felt like victory, even before the final scoring. Lindsay was acknowledging that I'd outstrategized her not through luck or beginner's fortune, but through superior strategic thinking applied systematically throughout the game. When we tallied the final scores, my victory was decisive. Not close enough to attribute to fortune or favorable card draws, but comprehensive enough to demonstrate genuine strategic superiority. I'd beaten Lindsay at her own game, in her chosen arena, using approaches she hadn't anticipated or prepared for. The aftermath was even more satisfying than the victory itself. Lindsay sat back in her chair, studying the final board position, with the kind of analytical attention she usually reserved for her own successful strategies. "I need to completely reconsider my assessment of your capabilities," she said finally, her voice carrying respect I'd never heard before. That wasn't beginner's luck. That was sophisticated strategic thinking applied with impressive discipline. "Thank you," I said simply, though my heart was racing with triumph. I've been trying to understand how strategic thinking applies across different domains. "Well, you've certainly accomplished that." She began packing up the game components with thoughtful precision. "I think next month's family game night is going to be much more interesting than usual." The drive home gave me time to process. What had just happened? I'd not only defeated Lindsay in single combat, but I'd done so convincingly enough to force her to acknowledge my strategic capabilities. The family dynamic that had marginalized me for 2 years was fundamentally shifting. But as I replayed the afternoon's events, I realized this was just the beginning. Lindsay wasn't going to accept her new status quietly. She'd been the family's strategic champion for too long to surrender that position without a fight. Next month's game night wouldn't be another test or evaluation. It would be war, with Lindsay fully prepared and fighting for her strategic reputation against an opponent she now recognized as genuinely dangerous. And I couldn't wait. The atmosphere at Carol and David's house felt charged with electricity the moment Jake and I walked through the front door. Something had shifted in the family dynamics over the past month, and everyone seemed aware that tonight would be different from previous gatherings. Carol greeted us with unusual excitement, her eyes bright with anticipation. "Emma, dear, Lindsay's been telling everyone about your incredible game last weekend. I can't wait to see what you two accomplish together tonight." Together. The word carried implications that made my stomach flutter with nervous energy. Carol was framing this as collaborative rather than competitive, but I could sense the undercurrent of expectation that ran deeper than casual entertainment. David emerged, from the kitchen carrying his customary beer, but his greeting carried a weight that hadn't been there before. "The strategic mastermind arrives," he said with a grin that seemed genuinely respectful rather than patronizing. "Lindsay's been setting up something special for tonight." Marcus was arranging chairs around the dining table with careful precision, positioning each seat to optimize viewing angles for what promised to be an intensive gaming session. Even Sophia seemed affected by the heightened energy, her usual exuberant chatter replaced by curious observation of the adult preparations. But it was Lindsay's presence that dominated the room's emotional landscape. She moved with purposeful energy, setting up multiple game boxes with the kind of systematic organization usually reserved for important presentations. Her smile when she saw me carried genuine warmth mixed with something that looked remarkably like anticipation for worthy competition. "Emma, perfect timing," she said, approaching with arms extended for an embrace that felt more significant than casual family greeting. "I've been looking forward to this all week." The hug lingered just long enough to feel like acknowledgement of our changed relationship. We were no longer family member and tolerated addition, but strategic equals. Preparing for intellectual combat. "I brought several options tonight," Lindsay continued, gesturing toward the impressive array of game boxes covering the side table. "I thought we might let everyone vote on what they'd prefer to tackle." Jake surveyed the collection with raised eyebrows. These weren't the accessible family games that had characterized previous gatherings. Terraforming Mars, Wingspan, Scythe, Power Grid, each box representing hours of complex strategic gameplay that would challenge even experienced players. "These look significantly more advanced than our usual selections," he observed, glancing between Lindsay and me with curiosity about how this escalation had developed. "Well, we've discovered that our group is capable of handling more sophisticated challenges," Lindsay replied, her eyes meeting mine with shared understanding of exactly what discoveries had led to this evolution. Carol was examining the game descriptions with mixture of excitement and concern. "These all sound fascinating, but are you sure they're not too complicated for a relaxed family evening?" "I think we might surprise ourselves," I said, feeling the confidence that had been building over weeks of intensive preparation. "Sometimes, the most rewarding experiences come from embracing complexity rather than avoiding it." David nodded approvingly at my response. Spoken like a true strategist. "What do you think, everyone? Should we venture into deeper waters tonight?" The family discussion that followed revealed how dramatically perceptions had shifted since my initial Splendor victory. Instead of protective concerns about my ability to handle advanced gameplay, everyone was actively seeking my input about game selection and strategic approaches. Marcus suggested terraforming Mars, intrigued by the engine-building mechanics that would reward long-term planning. Carol was drawn to Wingspan, attracted by the beautiful artwork and nature theme that seemed more approachable than pure economic simulation. Jake advocated for Scythe, interested in the combination of resource management and area control that would test multiple strategic skills simultaneously. But it was Lindsay who proposed the evening's ultimate challenge. "What if we tried something completely different? Instead of playing one long game, we could have a tournament format. Multiple shorter games, rotating partnerships, cumulative scoring across several different strategic challenges." The suggestion sparked immediate interest around the table. A tournament would test strategic adaptability rather than mastery of single game systems, requiring players to demonstrate competence across multiple gameplay styles and mechanics. "That sounds incredibly engaging," David said, already moving toward the game collection to assess options. "We could score each game individually and crown an overall strategic champion at the end of the evening." Champion. The word hung in the air with promise and threat in equal measure. Lindsay was proposing to formalize what had already become an informal competition for strategic recognition within the family hierarchy. "I love the idea," I said, meeting Lindsay's gaze directly. "It would be fascinating to see how different strategic approaches translate across various game systems." Jake was studying the logistics with his characteristic attention to detail. "How would scoring work across different games? Some have point scales in the hundreds, while others cap at 20 or 30 points. We could use placement scoring," Lindsay suggested. "First place gets 4 points, second gets 3, and so on. Simple and fair across any game type." The tournament format was agreed upon with enthusiasm that surprised me. What had started as casual family entertainment was evolving into serious competition, complete with formal scoring and championship implications. Lindsay selected our opening game with careful consideration, choosing Azul, a tile-laying strategy game that combined tactical decision-making with long-term pattern building. The rules were accessible enough to ensure everyone could participate effectively, but the strategic depth would reward careful planning and opponent analysis. As we arranged the colorful tiles and scoring boards, I felt the familiar pre-competition focus settling over my mind. This wasn't just about winning individual games anymore. This was about establishing myself as a legitimate strategic thinker, worthy of respect and recognition from Jake's family. The first round of Azul revealed how much everyone's approach to gameplay had evolved. Carol, who had previously focused on creating pretty patterns rather than optimal scoring, was now calculating point values with impressive precision. David was analyzing tile selection not just for his own benefit, but to deny opportunities to other players. Even Marcus was displaying strategic thinking that went far beyond his usual casual participation. But the real revelation was watching Lindsay and me navigate our new competitive dynamic. Gone was her condescending guidance and patient explanation of obvious moves. She was playing to win, making decisions based on strategic merit rather than educational value, treating me as an opponent worthy of her full attention and effort. I responded in kind, abandoning the hesitant, questioning approach that had characterized my early family game nights. Each tile selection was calculated to maximize my scoring while disrupting opponent strategies. When Lindsay attempted to claim a particularly valuable pattern, I blocked her access with positioning that forced her into suboptimal alternatives. "Nicely played," she said as my interference cascaded through her planning, forcing her to rebuild her approach entirely. "I didn't see that defensive move developing." The comment carried acknowledgement that I was thinking several moves ahead, anticipating her strategy and countering it effectively. For the first time in our gaming relationship, Lindsay was reacting to my moves rather than simply tolerating my presence. As the game progressed toward its conclusion, our competition had become the table's focal point. Carol and David were watching our strategic duel with fascination, commenting on particularly clever moves and analyzing the evolving board position like sports commentators, discussing championship matches. When final scores were tallied, I had achieved a narrow victory over Lindsay, with Carol claiming a respectable third place that surprised everyone, including herself. But more important than the specific results was the way the game had been played. The entire family had elevated their strategic thinking in response to the increased competition level. "One down, several to go," Lindsay said while packing up the tiles, her smile carrying genuine competitive excitement rather than forced good sportsmanship. "This tournament is going to be more challenging than I anticipated." Our second game was Splendor, the engine-building gem trader that had launched my strategic evolution. Playing it again in this context felt like returning to a battlefield where I'd won my first major victory, but now facing opponents who understood my capabilities. The familiarity of the mechanics allowed everyone to focus on advanced strategic elements rather than rule comprehension. Market manipulation became more sophisticated, with players blocking purchase opportunities and timing their moves to maximize disruption of opponent development. Lindsay had clearly studied the game more thoroughly since our previous encounter, implementing strategies that targeted my preferred development patterns while building more flexible engines that could adapt to multiple victory paths. But I had continued evolving as well, incorporating advanced techniques learned through continued practice at the dice roll. The game developed into an intense strategic duel that captivated the entire table. Carol was providing running commentary on our moves, analyzing the implications of each purchase decision with enthusiasm that surprised everyone. David was taking notes, tracking our strategic approaches with the systematic attention he'd once applied to engineering problems. "This is like watching masters at work," Marcus observed as Lindsay and I engaged in a complex sequence of moves that involved simultaneous market manipulation and engine optimization. "I'm learning more about strategic thinking tonight than I have in months of casual gaming." When I secured victory through a perfectly timed development card sequence that generated the exact points needed to cross the victory threshold, the table erupted in appreciation for the technical execution rather than simple congratulations. "That was surgical precision," David said, examining my final card layout with professional admiration. "The timing required to make that combination work was absolutely perfect." Lindsay nodded in agreement, her respect now completely genuine, rather than performative. "I saw what you were building toward, but couldn't find an effective way to disrupt it without compromising my own development." Brilliant endgame execution. 2 victories in the tournament had established me as the leader, but Lindsay's gracious acknowledgement of my strategic competence felt more valuable than any scoreboard position. I had achieved what I'd been working toward for months: recognition as a strategic equal rather than charitable inclusion. Our third game was Wings of Glory, a tableau-building strategy game that required balancing multiple resource types while constructing efficient point-generating combinations. The complexity was significantly higher than our previous selections, demanding sustained strategic focus and advanced planning capabilities. This time, Lindsay came out aggressively, leveraging her experience with similar engine-building mechanics to establish early advantages in multiple strategic areas. She was no longer underestimating my capabilities, bringing her full competitive intensity to bear from the opening moves. The game became our most intense strategic battle yet, with lead changes occurring multiple times as we adapted our approaches to counter each other's developing strategies. Carol and David had essentially become spectators to our competition, though they continued playing competently while focusing primary attention on our strategic duel. "You two are playing on a completely different level," Jake observed during a particularly complex sequence where Lindsay and I engaged in multi-turn resource manipulation that affected everyone's strategic options. "I feel like I'm watching championship-level competition." His comment crystallized what had been building throughout the evening. This wasn't family game night anymore. This was serious strategic competition between equally matched opponents who happened to be related by marriage. Lindsay ultimately claimed victory in Wings of Glory through superior endgame timing, but the margin was narrow enough to maintain suspense about the tournament's ultimate outcome. More importantly, her victory felt earned through strategic superiority, rather than my strategic inadequacy. "Outstanding game," I said while calculating scores, meaning the praise completely. "Your resource timing in the final rounds was impeccable." "Thank you," she replied, the acknowledgement carrying mutual respect that would have been impossible months earlier. "You're forcing me to play at a higher level than I've needed in years." As we prepared for the tournament's final game, the scoreboard showed Lindsay and me tied for the lead with Carol surprisingly close behind in third place. The evening had elevated everyone's strategic performance beyond what any of us had previously achieved in family settings. Lindsay selected Ticket to Ride for our conclusion, the railway building game that had featured in several previous family gatherings, but never with the intensity of strategic focus we were now bringing to every decision. "Perfect choice," David said while setting up the board. "This game rewards both tactical execution and strategic planning, so it should provide a fitting conclusion to an exceptional evening." The final game played out with championship-level intensity. Every route claim was calculated not just for individual benefit, but for its impact on opponent strategies. Blocking moves became more sophisticated, targeting crucial connections that would cascade through opponent planning. Lindsay and I traded strategic advantages throughout the game, our competition driving both of us to performance levels that impressed the entire family. When the final scores were calculated, I had achieved tournament victory by a margin narrow enough to acknowledge her strategic competence, while decisive enough to establish my credentials definitively. But the real victory was the transformation in family dynamics that had occurred over the course of the evening. I was no longer the artistic wife who needed patience and accommodation. I was a strategic competitor worthy of serious attention and genuine respect. "Congratulations, tournament champion," Lindsay said, extending her hand for a shake that felt like formal recognition of my changed status within the family hierarchy. "This has been the most challenging and enjoyable game night we've ever had." Carol was beaming with pride that seemed directed at all of us rather than individual achievement. "I can't believe how much our strategic thinking has evolved. This felt like watching professional competition." David raised his beer in a toast that carried ceremonial weight. "To Emma, our newest strategic master, and to family game nights that finally match our competitive potential." The drive home passed in comfortable silence, Jake and I both, processing the significance of what had occurred. I had not only proven my strategic capabilities, but had elevated the entire family's approach to competitive gameplay. "I'm proud of you," Jake said as we pulled into our driveway. "Not just for winning, but for transforming something that was making you miserable into something that brought out the best in everyone." That night, lying in bed while replaying the evening's strategic highlights, I realized that my campaign, for respect and recognition had achieved complete success. But more than that, I had discovered genuine enjoyment in high-level strategic competition that would continue long after the family dynamics had stabilized. Lindsay would never again dismiss my intellectual capabilities or suggest that I needed simpler challenges. The family would never again treat me as someone who required accommodation rather than worthy opponent. I had found my voice, proven my worth, and established myself as exactly the kind of strategic thinker I'd always known I could become. 3 months had passed since my tournament victory, and the Rodriguez family game nights had transformed into something neither Lindsay nor I could have imagined when this all began. What started as my personal campaign for respect had evolved into a genuine strategic renaissance that had elevated everyone's competitive spirit and gaming sophistication. The monthly gatherings now attracted attention from extended family members, who had never shown interest in board games before. Jake's cousin Miguel had started driving down from Fort Collins specifically for game night, bringing his teenage son, who was developing into a formidable strategic thinker. Carol's sister Janet had become a regular participant, abandoning her previous dismissal of those complicated board games in favor of enthusiastic engagement with increasingly complex strategic challenges. But the most significant change was in Lindsay herself. Our competition had awakened something in her that went beyond simple family game night dominance. She had begun attending strategy gaming conventions in Denver, joining online communities dedicated to advanced gameplay analysis, and building a personal collection of games that rivaled specialty hobby stores. I never realized how much I'd been coasting on natural talent, she confided to me during a quiet moment at Carol's birthday celebration in February. Competing against you forced me to actually study strategy theory instead of just relying on intuitive play. The admission meant more to me than any direct acknowledgement of my capabilities could have. Lindsay wasn't just respecting my strategic thinking, she was crediting our competition with improving her own approach to gameplay. We had become strategic partners in pushing each other toward higher levels of performance. Our March game night showcased just how dramatically the family's competitive landscape had evolved. Carol had suggested we tackle Twilight Imperium, a massive space empire game known for requiring entire days to complete and strategic thinking that operated on epic scales. The suggestion came from someone who 6 months earlier had worried that Splendor might be too complex for comfortable family entertainment. "Are we really ready for something that intensive?" David had asked, though his tone carried excitement rather than concern. "That's a 6 to 8 hour commitment with strategy that makes our usual games look like warm-up exercises." "I think we've proven we can handle sophisticated challenges," I replied, already researching optimal strategies for the game's intricate political and military systems. "Besides, we've been building toward this level of complexity for months." Jake was reviewing the game's components with the kind of systematic attention he usually reserved for complicated tax situations. "The logistics alone are impressive. Multiple decks of cards, modular board setup, simultaneous action planning. This is going to require coordination we've never attempted before." But it was Lindsay who provided the final push toward accepting the challenge. "We've spent months developing our strategic capabilities. Now we get to find out what we can accomplish when we really push our limits." The decision to attempt Twilight Imperium represented more than game selection. It was acknowledgement that our group had developed into something capable of tackling the most demanding challenges in strategic gaming. We were no longer a casual family gathering that happened to play board games. We had become serious strategic competitors who approached each challenge with the intensity usually reserved for professional competition. Preparation for our Twilight Imperium session began weeks in advance. Everyone studied rules, watched tutorial videos, and researched strategic approaches with dedication that surprised even me. Carol created detailed reference sheets summarizing complex rules interactions. David developed tracking systems for managing the game's intricate resource economies. Marcus designed custom player aids that would streamline the administrative overhead that could otherwise bog down gameplay. But Lindsay and I took preparation to levels that bordered on obsessive. We studied faction analysis guides, memorized optimal technology development paths, and analyzed diplomatic strategies with the thoroughness of actual political scientists. Our competition had evolved beyond simple game night victories into comprehensive, strategic education that was transforming both of us into genuinely sophisticated strategic thinkers. The weekend of our Twilight Imperium session arrived with weather that seemed designed for staying indoors with complex entertainment. March in Denver could be unpredictable, but this Saturday delivered steady snow that created perfect atmosphere for an epic gaming marathon. We gathered at Carol and David's house earlier than usual, knowing that setup alone would require substantial time before actual gameplay could begin. The dining room table had been expanded to its maximum configuration, with additional folding tables creating a gaming surface large enough to accommodate the game's sprawling galactic map. "This looks like mission control for a space program," Jake observed while surveying the impressive array of components we were organizing. "I'm starting to understand why this game has legendary status among serious strategists." The setup process itself became a collaborative exercise in organization and planning. Everyone contributed to sorting components, arranging reference materials, and ensuring that each player position had optimal access to shared resources. The systematic approach we brought to preparation reflected how much our group dynamics had evolved from casual entertainment towards serious competitive engagement. Lindsay had drawn the Mentak Coalition, a faction known for piracy-based economics and aggressive expansion strategies that would suit her naturally competitive instincts. I had selected the Universities of Jolnar, a science-focused civilization that rewarded long-term technological development and careful resource management. "Perfect faction choices," Carol commented while organizing her own Emirites of Hakan trading empire. "You've both selected civilizations that match your strategic personalities while creating interesting interaction potential." David was commanding the Federation of Sol, humanity's representative faction that emphasized military flexibility and political maneuvering. Marcus had chosen the Barony of Letnev, a war-focused empire that would complement David's military orientation while creating interesting alliance possibilities. Jake rounded out our galactic civilization with the clan of Sar, a nomadic faction that required unconventional strategic thinking and adaptation to unique gameplay mechanics that rewarded mobile rather than territorial approaches. As we began the game's opening rounds, the scope and complexity of strategic decision-making dwarfed anything we had previously attempted as a family group. Every action required consideration of immediate tactical benefits, long-term strategic implications, diplomatic consequences, and resource opportunity costs that created decision trees of staggering complexity. But rather than being overwhelmed by the challenge, everyone rose to meet it with strategic sophistication that would have been impossible months earlier. Carol was conducting trade negotiations with diplomatic finesse that surprised everyone, including herself. David was coordinating military operations with tactical precision that reflected genuine understanding of strategic timing and resource allocation. Marcus had developed into a formidable strategic opponent whose quiet, analytical approach often produced insights that more aggressive players overlooked. Jake was adapting to his faction's unconventional requirements with creative problem-solving that demonstrated how much his strategic thinking had evolved through months of competitive gameplay. The early game developed along lines that reflected everyone's growing strategic maturity. Instead of the random expansion and reactive decision-making that characterized inexperienced play, everyone was implementing coherent long-term strategies that demonstrated deep understanding of the game's victory conditions and optimal development paths. Lindsay established early dominance in military production and territorial expansion, leveraging her faction's piracy bonuses to fund aggressive development that threatened multiple opponents simultaneously. Her approach was classic Lindsay, efficient, aggressive, and calculated to maximize pressure on everyone else's strategic planning. But I was implementing a more patient approach that focused on technological advancement and economic development. building infrastructure that would support accelerated expansion in the middle and late game phases. The universities of Jolnar rewarded exactly the kind of long-term strategic thinking that had become my signature approach to complex games. "Emma's building toward something significant," David observed during one of the game's political phases. "Her technology development is creating options that won't be obvious until she's ready to execute whatever she's planning." The observation reflected how much everyone's strategic analysis had deepened. David wasn't just playing his own faction. He was actively analyzing opponent strategies and recognizing long-term implications of current decisions. This level of strategic awareness would have been impossible during our early game nights when everyone focused primarily on their own immediate tactical concerns. As the game progressed through its middle phases, diplomatic interactions became increasingly sophisticated. Temporary alliances formed and dissolved based on strategic necessity rather than personal relationships. Trade agreements reflected genuine economic analysis rather than casual cooperation. Military threats carried diplomatic weight because they were backed by actual strategic capability rather than empty posturing. The complexity of managing multiple strategic objectives simultaneously while responding to constantly evolving diplomatic and military situations pushed everyone toward their highest levels of strategic performance. This wasn't just advanced board gaming. This was genuine strategic thinking applied to complex systems with multiple competing objectives and limited resources. Lindsay's aggressive expansion had secured significant territorial advantages, but the military focus required for maintaining her empire was limiting her technological development and creating vulnerability to opponents who had invested more heavily in economic infrastructure. Her position was strong but potentially brittle if coordinated opposition could exploit her resource limitations. My technological advantages were beginning to generate the accelerated development I had planned for, but translating research bonuses into territorial expansion required careful timing to avoid triggering premature military responses from opponents, who might recognize the threat too late to counter effectively. Carol's trading empire had become the session's diplomatic centerpiece, with everyone needing her economic cooperation while simultaneously competing for her strategic allegiances. Her position demonstrated how sophisticated her strategic thinking had become, leveraging economic necessity to create political influence that extended far beyond her military capabilities. The game's climactic phases played out with intensity that surprised everyone, including those of us who had been anticipating this level of strategic complexity. Victory conditions that had seemed distant during early rounds suddenly became achievable through multiple different strategic paths, creating uncertainty about ultimate outcomes that maintained engagement despite the session's extended duration. Political maneuvering became crucial as players recognized that pure military or economic dominance wouldn't be sufficient for victory without diplomatic support for critical late-game objectives. Alliance structures that had been stable for hours shifted rapidly as everyone recognized final victory opportunities and the coalition possibilities required to achieve or prevent them. Lindsay's territorial empire provided strong foundation for multiple victory paths, but achieving any of them required resources that were increasingly contested by opponents who understood exactly what she was attempting. Her aggressive early game had created the strategic positions she needed, but converting those positions into actual victory required diplomatic cooperation from people who had every incentive to prevent her success. My technological development had generated the research advantages I had planned for, but the endgame was revealing that pure technological superiority needed territorial control and political influence to achieve actual victory conditions. The strategic approach that had served me well in shorter games was proving insufficient for the epic scope of Twilight Imperium's victory requirements, but the session's real revelation was watching how everyone's strategic thinking had evolved to meet the game's demands. Complex decisions that would have paralyzed our group months earlier were being resolved through systematic analysis and collaborative discussion that demonstrated genuine strategic sophistication. Carol was coordinating trade agreements and diplomatic alliances with skill that would have impressed professional negotiators. David was managing military operations across multiple fronts with tactical awareness that reflected deep understanding of strategic timing and resource optimization. Marcus was identifying strategic opportunities that more obvious approaches had overlooked, contributing insights that influenced everyone's planning. Jake was adapting to his faction's unconventional requirements with creative solutions that demonstrated how much his analytical capabilities had developed through months of competitive gameplay. His nomadic civilization required strategic thinking that operated outside traditional territorial concepts, and he was meeting that challenge with innovation that surprised everyone. As the session moved toward its conclusion after nearly 8 hours of intensive strategic competition, victory possibilities remained genuinely uncertain. Multiple players had developed positions that could achieve victory through different strategic paths, creating endgame scenarios that required everyone to simultaneously pursue their own objectives while preventing opponents from achieving theirs. The final rounds played out with dramatic tension that would have been impossible to sustain without the strategic engagement everyone had developed throughout the session. Political negotiations became increasingly crucial, as players recognized that victory would require not just individual strategic execution, but coalition building and diplomatic maneuvering that reflected genuine understanding of everyone's strategic positions and objectives. Lindsay's territorial dominance provided multiple victory paths, but achieving any of them required resources and political support that were increasingly difficult to secure as everyone understood exactly what she needed to accomplish. Her aggressive strategy had created strong foundations for victory, but converting those foundations into actual success required diplomatic skills that our months of competition had helped her develop. My technological advantages were generating the strategic options I had planned for, but the endgame was demonstrating that pure research superiority needed integration with territorial control and political influence to achieve victory conditions that reflected Twilight Imperium's comprehensive strategic requirements. But the session's ultimate outcome became less important than the recognition of what our group had accomplished together. We had successfully tackled one of strategic gaming's most demanding challenges, maintaining engagement and strategic sophistication, throughout a session that would have been impossible months earlier. When Carol achieved victory through a combination of economic development, diplomatic maneuvering, and perfectly timed political objectives, the accomplishment felt like validation of everyone's strategic growth rather than individual triumph. Her victory required strategic thinking that incorporated economic planning, diplomatic negotiation, and tactical execution in ways that demonstrated how much her capabilities had evolved since our early game nights. "That was extraordinary," Lindsay said, while we began the substantial process of packing up the game's numerous components. "I feel like we just completed graduate-level coursework in strategic thinking and diplomatic negotiation." David was reviewing his notes with the kind of analytical attention he had once reserved for complex engineering projects. "The strategic complexity we managed tonight exceeded anything I've encountered outside professional contexts. This group has developed capabilities I wouldn't have thought possible for casual gaming." Jake was examining the final board position with appreciation for the strategic sophistication everyone had demonstrated. Looking at how this developed, everyone was playing at levels that would have been impossible when we started this journey. We've all become genuinely formidable strategic thinkers. The drive home through Denver's snowy streets provided time to process the significance of what had occurred. Our family game nights had evolved from casual entertainment into serious, strategic education that was transforming everyone involved into more sophisticated analytical thinkers. But more importantly, the campaign I had initiated to gain respect and recognition had achieved complete success while creating something far more valuable than individual acknowledgement. I had helped create a family dynamic based on mutual strategic respect and collaborative intellectual challenge that benefited everyone involved. Over the following weeks, the impact of our Twilight Imperium session continued reverberating through family interactions beyond game night contexts. Lindsay and I had begun collaborating on strategic analysis projects that had nothing to do with board games, applying the analytical frameworks we had developed to business challenges and personal decision-making situations. Carol had started a neighborhood game group that was introducing other families to strategic gaming, spreading the enthusiasm and intellectual engagement that had transformed our own family dynamics. David was using strategic thinking concepts in his retirement consulting work, finding that the analytical approaches he had developed through competitive gaming translated effectively to business problem-solving. Marcus had begun attending strategy gaming conventions, representing our family group in competitive tournaments where he was performing surprisingly well against experienced opponents from across the region. Jake was applying strategic thinking frameworks to his accounting practice, finding that the systematic analysis he had learned through gaming improved his professional problem-solving capabilities. But the most significant long-term impact was in my relationship with Lindsay, which had evolved from resigned tolerance to genuine strategic partnership. We had begun planning collaborative projects that would leverage our different analytical strengths while maintaining the competitive dynamic that had driven both of us toward higher levels of performance. "I need to admit something," Lindsay said during a coffee meeting in April where we were planning our next strategic gaming challenge. "When you first started winning games, I thought it was lucky timing or beginner's fortune. I was completely wrong about your capabilities, and I'm grateful that you proved me wrong in ways that improved all of us." The acknowledgement represented complete transformation of our relationship from the dynamic that had characterized my early integration into Jake's family. Lindsay was acknowledging not just my strategic capabilities, but the positive impact that our competition had created for everyone involved. "I'm grateful for the competition you provided," I replied honestly. "Without your challenge and the respect I had to earn, I never would have discovered capabilities I didn't know I possessed. Our strategic rivalry created growth opportunities for both of us." That evening, Jake and I were preparing dinner in our kitchen when he broached a subject that had been developing throughout our months of strategic gaming evolution. "I've been thinking about something," he said, while chopping vegetables with the methodical precision that characterized his approach to most tasks. "Your strategic thinking abilities have grown dramatically, but I'm realizing they were always there. The games just gave you context to demonstrate capabilities that your design work already required." His observation touched on something I had been recognizing myself: the strategic analysis, long-term planning, and systematic problem-solving that had made me successful in board game competition were the same capabilities that had driven my professional success in graphic design and brand strategy. "You're right," I said, considering the connections between different applications of strategic thinking. The games provided a framework for demonstrating analytical capabilities that people hadn't recognized in creative contexts. But the underlying strategic thinking was always part of how I approached design challenges. "Which means," Jake continued, "that everyone who dismissed your intellectual capabilities was fundamentally wrong about how strategic thinking operates across different domains. Creative problem-solving and analytical strategic thinking aren't separate skill sets. They're different applications of the same underlying cognitive capabilities." The recognition felt like the final piece of understanding about what had occurred. Over the past months, my campaign for respect hadn't just proven my strategic gaming abilities. It had demonstrated that strategic thinking transcended the artificial boundaries that people created between creative and analytical capabilities. Our next family gathering was scheduled for May, and Lindsay had proposed something that represented the ultimate evolution of our strategic gaming journey. Instead of selecting games for the family to play, she suggested that we design and develop our own strategic game that would incorporate elements from all the challenges we had mastered over the past months. "We've proven we can handle the most complex games that exist," she explained during the planning call that included everyone in the family. "Now we should find out if we can create something original that reflects our understanding of strategic Game design principles. The proposal was ambitious beyond anything we had previously attempted, but everyone embraced the challenge with enthusiasm that reflected how much confidence we had developed in our strategic capabilities. Game design required not just understanding how to play strategically, but comprehending the underlying systems that created meaningful strategic decisions. Carol volunteered to coordinate the collaborative design process, applying the diplomatic and organizational skills she had developed through months of complex strategic gaming. David offered to handle the mathematical analysis required to ensure game balance and strategic depth. Marcus would focus on component design and visual presentation, leveraging his artistic sensibilities in ways that paralleled my own creative contributions. Jake would manage project logistics and playtesting coordination, while Lindsay and I would collaborate on the core strategic mechanics that would define the gameplay experience. Our partnership represented the complete transformation of our relationship from antagonistic competition to collaborative creation. The game design project consumed our attention throughout the spring, with weekly meetings that applied the same analytical intensity we brought to complex strategic gaming to the challenge of creating original entertainment. We researched game design theory, analyzed successful strategic games for mechanical insights, and developed prototypes that we tested obsessively to refine the strategic experience. The collaborative process revealed how much everyone's analytical capabilities had evolved since our early game nights. Carol was contributing insights about player psychology and social dynamics that influenced fundamental design decisions. David was performing statistical analysis that ensured optimal balance between different strategic approaches. Marcus was creating visual design elements that enhanced strategic clarity while maintaining aesthetic appeal. Jake was managing iterative development processes with systematic attention to detail that ensured consistent improvement through multiple design iterations. But the most significant aspect of the design project was watching Lindsay and me work together as strategic partners rather than competitive opponents. Our different analytical approaches created synergies that generated design insights neither of us could have developed independently. This is what I should have recognized from the beginning, Lindsay reflected during one of our design sessions. Your creative analytical approach generates strategic insights that pure logical analysis misses. We're more effective as collaborative partners than as individual competitors. The completed game, which we titled Convergence, incorporated engine-building mechanics, territorial control, resource management, and diplomatic negotiation in ways that reflected everything we had learned through months of strategic gaming experience. But more importantly, it represented tangible evidence of the analytical and creative capabilities that our family had developed through collaborative intellectual challenge. Our first complete playtest of Convergence took place during our June family gathering, with everyone approaching the experience as both game designers evaluating their creation and strategic players engaging with a new competitive challenge. The game performed remarkably well, generating the kind of meaningful strategic decisions and engaging gameplay that characterized the best commercial strategic games. We actually created something genuinely sophisticated, David said while reviewing the final scores and strategic outcomes. This isn't just a functional game. It's a strategic experience that would appeal to serious strategy gamers beyond our family group. Carol was already discussing possibilities for sharing Convergence with her neighborhood game group and potentially submitting it to game design competitions that could provide broader recognition for our collaborative creation. The project had evolved from family entertainment into potential commercial product that reflected our collective strategic and creative capabilities. But the game's greatest success was what it represented about the transformation that had occurred in our family dynamics over the past months. We had evolved from a group that included one dismissed creative member and one dominant strategic player into a collaborative team capable of creating original strategic entertainment that reflected sophisticated understanding of game design principles. Lindsay and I had become genuine strategic partners whose different analytical approaches generated insights and creative solutions that neither of us could achieve independently. Our competitive relationship had evolved into collaborative partnership that enhanced both of our capabilities while creating value for everyone involved. As we packed up our prototype game after the successful playtest session, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this point. What began as my personal campaign for recognition and respect had transformed into collaborative intellectual development that had enhanced everyone's analytical capabilities while creating family dynamics based on mutual respect and shared challenge. "I want to thank you," I said to Lindsay as we organized the game components we had designed together. "Your competition and challenge pushed me to discover capabilities I didn't know I possessed, but more importantly, our partnership has created something valuable for everyone. Thank you for persisting when it would have been easier to accept dismissive treatment," she replied. "Your determination to prove your strategic capabilities created growth opportunities for all of us, and I'm grateful for everything that resulted from your refusal to accept underestimation." That night, as Jake and I drove home through Denver's summer evening, I considered everything that had changed since that first game night, when Lindsay had suggested that strategy games weren't for everyone. Not only had I proven my strategic capabilities, but I had helped create family dynamics that brought out everyone's best analytical and creative potential. "Are you satisfied with how this all developed?" Jake asked as we pulled into our driveway. "More than satisfied," I replied honestly. "I wanted recognition and respect, but what we created together exceeded anything I had imagined when this began." The transformation had been complete and permanent. I was no longer the artistic family member who needed patient accommodation and simplified challenges. I was a strategic thinker whose creative analytical approach contributed unique insights to collaborative problem-solving and competitive gaming alike. But more importantly, our family had discovered that intellectual challenge and strategic competition could enhance relationships rather than creating division. We had become a group that brought out everyone's highest capabilities through collaborative engagement with complex challenges that none of us could have tackled individually. Lindsay would never again suggest that strategy games weren't for everyone, because we had proven that strategic thinking was a capability that could be developed and applied across diverse contexts by anyone willing to embrace intellectual challenge. Our family game nights had become strategic education that was transforming all of us into more sophisticated analytical thinkers. The monthly gatherings continued throughout the summer and into the fall, with our group tackling increasingly sophisticated challenges while maintaining the collaborative and competitive dynamics that had emerged from our initial strategic rivalry. We had created something sustainable and valuable that would continue enhancing everyone's capabilities for years to come. And occasionally, when new family members or friends joined our gatherings and expressed concern about their ability to handle strategic complexity, Lindsay and I would exchange meaningful glances that acknowledged everything we had learned about the development of strategic capabilities through patient challenge and mutual respect. Everyone could become a strategic thinker. Everyone could contribute unique insights to collaborative problem-solving. Everyone deserved recognition for their analytical capabilities rather than dismissive assumptions about their limitations. The games had taught us that, but more importantly, they had given us frameworks for demonstrating and developing those capabilities in ways that created mutual respect and enhanced relationships among people who might otherwise have never discovered what they could accomplish together. Our strategic journey had transformed not just individual capabilities, but family dynamics that would continue creating value and intellectual growth for everyone involved. And that transformation began with someone refusing to accept underestimation and determining to prove that strategic thinking was accessible to anyone willing to embrace the challenge. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.